The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Biosecurity for Pastured and Organic Poultry. My name is Rich Myers, and I'm the editor at the National Center for Appropriate Technology, more commonly known as NCAT. NCAT is a nationwide nonprofit organization. We have 6 regional headquarters across the country, and we work on we work on issues pertaining to sustainable agriculture, sustainable energy, and sustainable communities. Today's webinar will give participants a chance to have their questions answered by our experts, but we're always glad to help, and you can get in touch with us anytime. We'll have contact information later in the webinar. Today's webinar is being webcasted by NCAT and is funded by the Southern Risk Management Education Center, which is part of the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture and funded by the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And we're grateful to the SRMEC for its funding and support of this webinar. Today's presentation will be about an hour long, maybe a little longer, and we'll follow it up with time for questions from you folks who are attending. As you're listening, you can type in any questions you might have in the questions box on your screen, and I'll sort of gather them up and sort them out and have our presenter today, Kevin Ellis, answer as many as we have time for following his presentation. And please don't be shy about asking questions during today's webinar. We won't be able to get to all of them during the webinar, but our experts will get back to you via email in the days to come. And the webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCAT's ATTRA webpage, which is www.ncat.attra.org. ATTRA, which is also known as the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service, is funded through a cooperative agreement with the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service, and we're grateful for their support as well. Also, before we begin, I just want to remind our viewers to take a few minutes to complete a survey for today's webinar. When the webinar is over and you sign out, you'll get the survey right away, and we appreciate your taking the time to do it. It helps us to improve future webinars. And remember, as I said, you're always welcome to get with us about your sustainable agriculture related questions. You're welcome to call our toll-free technical assistance line at 1-800-346-9140. And if you prefer to ask a question via email, we also invite you to go to our ATTRA project website, once again, www.attra.ncat.org, and click on the Ask an Ag Expert button, and it will walk you through the process. And don't worry if you didn't get that phone number or website, they'll be on your screen at the end of the webinar. And we respond to all the questions we receive, and I might want to just emphasize a little bit that the service is offered free of charge. Okay, our presenter today is Kevin Ellis. Kevin joined NCAT in 2013, and he has many years of experience in poultry production. Before coming to work at NCAT, Kevin received his degree in poultry science at Texas A&M University. While he was in College Station, Kevin also assisted in research and extension in the areas of poultry health and nutrition. So I think it's time to get started, so let me turn things over to Kevin.
All right, thanks, Rich. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. I really appreciate you sitting in. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how do you keep your poultry flocks healthy and happy. That's kind of the overall goal of this, and a big component of it is biosecurity, which we'll get into in a little bit. Like I said, when people think pastured or organic poultry, they kind of have these idyllic pictures in their head of healthy chickens foraging for different foods on nice, lush, green pastures. So that's kind of our end goal here. And so there is a little bit of planning and kind of an overall mindset that needs to be taken into account to kind of help get towards this goal. Next slide, please. So these are kind of the keys the keys to getting to having a healthy flock, and some of the things we'll be talking about today. Overall, prevention is way less expensive and way less of a hassle than having to treat a flock for disease. So we're going to be focusing a lot on overall prevention And again, it's more of just kind of a mindset in the way you think about how things interact with your farm. It's hard to control some of these external factors, such as things like wild birds or even just wind patterns bringing in fomites to your farm, but there are things we can control and things to keep in mind. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Also, we'll talk a little bit about recognizing if there is a problem, how to monitor your flock, things to look for, and how to get in touch with people who can do the necessary tests to decide or to discover if there's a problem with your flock. Then also a little bit about getting the proper assistance and some of the steps to go through for that. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I guess I should put a definition to biosecurity so far. Really, it's practices or planning in order to reduce contact with possible disease-causing agents. And these, again, revolve around the idea of prevention rather than mitigation, in trying to reduce the opportunities for any kind of potential contamination. And this can include planning to exclude certain things from your farm, controlling foot traffic, looking to incorporate vaccinations, pest control. All of these different things can kind of come together and be a part of your overall biosecurity planning. Next slide, please. So why is biosecurity and biosecurity planning important? Well, a really good example of why it is back in the spring of 2015. If you had noticed around that time, egg prices kind of surged in the springtime. And a big reason for that was an outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza. In this case, it was H5N2. Over the course of winter into spring, it was kind of wet, cold conditions, which really allowed avian influenza to kind of thrive and spread. And spread pretty quickly out of the Pacific Northwest, the Washington area, down through the Midwest. Iowa, Minnesota were hit particularly hard by this disease outbreak. Over 48 million dead birds nationwide, and this included laying hens, broilers or meat-producing chickens, turkeys, backyard flocks, large-scale flocks. No one was really immune from it. Again, it was initially spread by wild migratory birds, but there were some lapses in biosecurity planning that really kept it from being contained. And also, some farms had biosecurity plans in place, but they'd kind of lapsed on their adherence to them. They weren't really as stringent as they may have been as they were in the beginning. So that really kind of made it more difficult to control it into specific areas and really keep it from spreading as far as it did. Since then, there's been a few smaller outbreaks, but because I think this was such a stark example of the importance of biosecurity, they have been contained since then. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about how disease spreads. There's two major modes of transmission. Direct, which is pretty self-explanatory. A sick bird will come into contact with a healthy bird. And this could be chicken to chicken or through wild birds. And the other direct mode is contact with a recovered carrier, meaning that one bird got sick with something and then recovered, but is still a carrier for that disease and spread it to a healthy bird that may have not been exposed. Indirect contact is contact with an infected object, and in the case of poultry or a farm scenario, this is anything from shoes or equipment, something like that, where the bird comes in contact with something that has some kind of disease agent on it. We tend to call these things fomites, is the technical term for it. So it can be direct or indirect. Both of these ways will get your birds sick. I'm talking about disease spread, and especially with poultry flocks. I tend to kind of liken it to, imagine you're on a bus with a lot of people, and one person has the flu. And so just thinking about being in that confined space, how easy something can spread. That can kind of happen with poultry as well. It doesn't take very many, and because they move and inside of the flock pretty quickly, it can spread very rapidly. Next slide, please. So some potential sources of disease that we'll kind of go over. Again, contact with other poultry, that's a very big one. One bird can get sick, whether it's more vulnerable to a specific disease, and then pass that on to the rest of the flock. Some of the controllable things are your shoes or your clothing or your equipment that you use on farm. We'll talk a little bit about some of the strategies for managing that. Again, rodents or wild birds, any kind of wildlife on your farm has a chance to transmit something. Again, this is mostly wild birds or migratory waterfowl, but they especially in pastured or organic flocks, represent a big challenge in control and limiting their interactions with your flock. Again, contaminated feed or air or water or soil can all cause sickness or disease in some way if, again, they're contaminated. I'm not saying all feed, air, water, or soil will get your birds sick, but there is a chance for that. And then again, vehicles visiting or making deliveries can also be a source for disease. Next slide, please. Like I said, and I mentioned a few times, wild birds are kind of one of the #1 things to be aware of when it comes to pastured organic poultry. They're out there. Birds are going to come onto your farm. Again, it was the source of the 2015 outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza. That's kind of the one that waterfowl or ducks are usually linked to. But again, it's hard to really limit them from coming on your farm. This is kind of where I talk about that mindset and being aware. You know these birds are going to come. How can you limit the overall exposure of your flock with these migratory birds? And a big thing is being aware of migration patterns that come through your farm, at what times of year, what kind of birds will be on your farm. And again, just being aware of your overall layout. And this includes bodies of water or small ponds that will be attractive for waterfowl to stop at, and especially limiting your poultry from coming near those areas. So really you need to have a good overall quote unquote bird's eye view of your farm to know what areas you have and when to avoid them. Next slide, please. So talking about migratory waterfowl or migratory birds in general, there are 4 specific flyways throughout the continental United States that you need to be aware of. And these have been roughly circled here to kind of give you an idea of where your state might lie. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service has some really good information on what kind of birds go through these areas at what time of year. And I'm sure your state-specific wildlife service will have some more information as well. So if you're moving to a new farm or not really sure what kind of birds to expect and when, that would be a really good source of information for you to kind of find that out. Next slide, please. So again, I want to stress that with wild birds, you want to minimize the contact as much as possible. Even some large-scale farms have problems with minimizing contact with birds. Smaller ones can find their way into large poultry houses. I've seen it happen myself. But again, it's just doing what you can to reduce the chances that there might be any contact. There are some designs for feeders and waters that are accessible to only poultry. These are called treble feeders. It's a feeder where the bird steps up onto a platform that opens up a lid and they're able to eat out of that feeder. These are especially helpful in reducing spillage and birds taking out some of the feed that you would want to feed your own flock. Some of these feeders and waters can be a little costly. I have to say I haven't really seen any good designs for homemade ones yet, but it is an option and something to maybe think about. Another idea is, as seen here, we have a house with rotating pastures around it. They put up some netting over the top to reduce birds coming down onto the ground with their own chickens. This is pretty helpful. You don't want a lot of birds commingling in the areas that your chickens are at. But again, I would say that if you're using netting, use something that's a standout color so birds don't get trapped or caught into it. Next slide, please. So another housing consideration, there are a lot of very popular pastured poultry houses currently that are designed to exclude any wildlife or wild birds, such as these. These are a very popular design, a hoop house with a tarp over the top with automatic waters and bell feeders. Something like this is very good at excluding wild birds from getting close to the water or feed. Not to say that your chickens may come in contact with their droppings if you're rotating down the pasture, but it will cut off almost all contact with wild birds trying to get at that feed, which is a major attractant to those. These are really great in keeping out predators. There's chicken wire on the side, and it can really help cut down that contact with predators also. Next slide, please. So some of the other things trying to get at your birds or your feed or rats and mice, if you're using bait stations, make sure you keep them away from anywhere your flock can get into. They're especially helpful to have around areas where you're storing your feed. If you are certified organic, the only current rodenticide you can use is vitamin D3 at this time. Again, building pens to exclude, sometimes chicken wire isn't enough. Hardware cloth or a lower or a smaller and sturdier wire can be used. And then scare-offs, I found certain scents sometimes help keep away smaller critters. And one that I found in excluding raccoons or possums is using cayenne pepper. These animals move around poultry pens with their nose to the ground, and what I found is putting out some of that while they're kind of moving around investigating a poultry pen. They'll get kind of a nose full of this cayenne pepper, which will burn quite a bit, and usually that will keep them away. They won't want to come back to that area. So it's just kind of a small trick I learned early on that actually kind of helps exclude some wildlife that might want to get at your birds or could possibly transmit something in the future. Next slide, please. So moving on to something you can control a little bit better, a big part of disease control starts when the birds are young. And for a lot of people, this means buying day-old chicks from a hatchery somewhere from the United States. Usually you buy them online or through mail order, and they come through the post office. A big part of this is you want to make sure you're getting your chicks from a hatchery that will be certified that those chicks are going to be healthy. And a big part of this is through the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS. There's the National Poultry Improvement Plan, or NPIP. You'll want to make sure that your hatchery is inspected and certified NPIP approved. This program looks to exclude major poultry diseases such as Newcastle or avian influenza. They have to do yearly tests on their breeder flocks. Usually it's a blood test to make sure that there are none of these diseases. So usually ask your hatchery if they have that. In most cases they will, and they'll advertise it. Again, also reputation. Talk to other farmers in the area or other farmers who have bought from hatcheries and see what kind of luck they've had with getting birds and how healthy they've been overall. This is oftentimes a really good source of knowing if a hatchery is having some problems. If you're wanting to raise more heritage type breeds or specialty breeds, talk to your breeder about if they're very resistant to disease or heat. Some may be bred for that. Some conventional breeds, such as really high laying white leghorns or the Cornish cross, in some cases can be a little bit more susceptible to disease when they're raised out on pasture. So you might want to talk and see if the breeder has really looked for that, or if it's something that they have looked to kind of breed into their lines. So again, starting a dialogue with your hatchery and other farmers around you and what they're using is very important when we're talking about sourcing. Next slide, please. So I get a lot of questions about if I'm ordering chicks or wanting to start laying hen flock, should I bring home day-old chicks or older birds? And in most cases, I'd say go with day-old chicks. There's more of an investment up front in time and feed costs to get them up to lay. But I think from a health perspective, they adapt to their surroundings a little bit better. In many cases, they're more used to the conditions that you're raising them in, and will be able to thrive when they're actually starting to lay. Also, there's always a risk when you're bringing new animals on your farm that something may go wrong when it comes to health, that they might be a transmitter of something. So it's good to keep that in mind. Usually with day-old chicks, you're starting from the ground floor and helping to build their immunity so it better suits your farm. I would say when buying pullets, sometimes they're raised in larger houses, which may be a shock to their system when you introduce them to a pasture immediately. I've talked to some farmers where this hasn't gone so well in the past, and they end up losing a lot of birds. So it's just something to be aware of and to think of. At this time, when the birds are about a day old, monitoring their behavior is going to give you big clues as to if they're going to be healthy over their lifespan. And I want to emphasize this point, and I'll probably say it quite a few more times before the end of this presentation, but never allow day-old chicks or chicks in the brooder to have contact with fully grown birds. Fully grown birds may have recovered from something that you have not noticed, or have more immunity than the chicks will at this point, and so they can really pass something on that the chicks may not be well suited to handle at this point in time. Next slide, please. So before the birds arrive, you need to take some considerations to make sure that your flock won't be contaminated by something from a past flock. And for this, I always recommend that you clean out a brooder completely. Replace the shavings, disinfect the walls and floor if you can. I would say use a floor that is easy to clean, whether it's something like here, painted wood, or concrete. Those are all very good to help kind of clean that out and maybe put down a light sanitizing agent. And a big one is clean your feeders and waters. Make sure that there's no buildup of algae on the waters, that you can flush the lines, and pull out any feed that may have been sitting in those feeders for a long time, as there might be some possibility for some mold. And at this point, when you're cleaning, it's also a good time to do an overall check and see if there's any places birds or rodents may have gotten in, or if there's a buildup of any kind of dust or dander. These are all times to kind of sweep it up, clean it out, and do as much as you can. If you can't clean, or you're kind of in a hurry, I would say give that brooder time to rest in order to make sure some of those pathogens or bugs die off. So I would say at least 2 weeks, maybe a month in between flocks. You'll really want to do an all-in, all-out approach with your birds and with the conditions they're in. Next slide, please. So at this point, chicks are rapidly developing, and so are their immune systems, their skeletal systems, their organ structures. They're all developing very quickly. So at this point, one of the things I've noticed is leg injuries are pretty common. At this time, those bones are really building up quickly, and so you want to make sure that they have solid ground to stand and walk on. And for this, a lot of people, it depends on what bedding you're using and the nutrition as well. For this, for the first couple of weeks, usually 1 to 2 weeks, I like to put down either burlap, which has been washed or cleaned from the last flock, or paper towels. Just take a roll and roll it one way across and back, all the way to cover the brooder. And this really gives them something to kind of grip and as they walk. If you kind of liken it to, you don't want to walk kind of on shifting sands, like on the beach, when you're kind of learning how to move around, it'll throw off your whole system. So this really gives them a good grip, and really helps them develop their legs in a correct manner. When we started doing this, we saw a sharp decrease in splayed legs or crooked legs, anything like that. So I'd recommend that. Have it down for a week or two and then pull it up and you have fresh bedding underneath. As far as bedding is concerned, I recommend pine shavings. Some people use peat moss, which is fine. I would say one of the big ones to avoid is using newspaper, because it can oftentimes be very slick. And at this point, monitor your nutrition. Make sure they're getting the correct vitamin premix in their feed, or that they're getting a correct feed ration, because that will go a long way into developing not only their legs, but their whole skeletal system and other organs. Next slide, please. So in the brooder, again, they are very susceptible to changes or external factors. So some of the factors you want to really monitor are your overall moisture. Any buildup of manure can sometimes lead to some moisture present in the brooder. This is why having ventilation is important, to move that excess water and kind of smells out of the brooder and bringing in clean, fresh air, and it'll help dry out those shavings as well. Ammonia is a big one. This comes off of their manure. If you smell ammonia while standing in the brooder, it's likely that there's too much down, and the shavings either need to be turned or mixed, or more need to be added, or you need to replace them entirely. Because if you can smell it, chances are down on the ground, it's at a very high level, which is going to cause some respiratory issues. And I'd say one of the biggest ones here is the temperature. Chicks at this stage are still feathering out, so they need a very warm, safe, secure place. And for this, you'll want to start at about 90 to 95 degrees and stair step down roughly a degree a day or 5 degrees each week until you match the ambient temperature. Again, the brooder needs to have at least 2 weeks of downtime between flocks to really prevent any issues with something like, say, coccidiosis. Rushing to put a new set of birds into the brooder afterwards can sometimes lead into some disease issues. And then one of the big things I'd like to stress is just observe and record your flock. And again, I'll probably say this a few more times, but really spend some time in the brooder when they're young. They will tell you how they're feeling. You really want what I'd like to call controlled chaos, where you have birds kind of doing a little bit of everything. Some are eating, some are having water, some are away from the light, some are under it. If you see a pattern in any one thing, something may be off. For instance, if they're too cold, they're going to be likely huddled under the nearest available heat source. So really kind of keep in mind some of these clues that they're going to give you. And then record if there's any changes in feed consumption, if there's a sharp drop off, that may be an early warning sign. If there's a lot of mortalities or mortalities you can't really link to anything, there may be a problem as well. So definitely keep reports when you're in the brooding stage of poultry production. Next slide, please. So moving outside of the brooder and to the farm more in general, let's talk a little bit about other people coming onto your farm, because that can be a big opportunity for disease-causing agents to be exposed to your farm. And one of the ones is unexpected visitors. Some people, or some farms I've talked to have had problems with people just pulling up, seeing chickens out in pasture and say, oh, it might be fun to post a picture with me with chickens on Instagram or Facebook, and then they just walk out and start taking pictures. So this can be a problem. You don't know exactly what's on the bottom of their shoes, so to speak, what they may have walked through, and how that can be brought onto your farm. Having a perimeter fence kind of helps with this, obviously. It doesn't have to be barbed wires here. It can just be kind of a basic fence. And sometimes warning signs or just signs that say, hi, this is an active farm. Please check in at the front or visit the farm stand, something like that, to just tell people that they shouldn't be out on the pastures without letting you know. It's basically as easy as that. So you want to do something to kind of reduce any unexpected visitors. Next slide, please. For the expected visitors, though, there are a few things to kind of keep in mind. I work with a lot of farmers that share the information or the knowledge they've gained over the years and do a lot of educational tours. So they bring on current farmers or prospective farmers to come look, see how they do things, and maybe consider some of that to implement on their own farms. Again, with working with other farmers that may have birds, you'll want people to wear a fresh set of clothes or shoes that they may not have taken out on pasture with their own birds. This is especially important if they are working on their own farm. They need to reduce any kind of contact through those, again, fomites, their shoes or their clothing or their equipment. When you're doing tours, one of the big points to note is you want to move from your younger birds to your older ones. Again, it's this system of immunity where older birds may have recovered from something, and let's say you step through some of their manure and then walk into the brooder, then the birds in the brooder may be exposed to that and not have the required immunity. So really, if you want to start from the brooder, take a look at those, and then move out to pasture and look at some of the older birds. That's generally how I would say to structure that. I'd also say maybe stay outside of any fencing such as seen here. This is that electro netting fencing, which is really easy to move, but maybe have the tour group stand outside. But if they are going to get in, there are a few considerations that can be taken as well. Next slide, please. So some more expected people coming to your farm would be on-farm customers. In a lot of cases, it's how you can sell certain products depending on inspections or exemptions. But it's also a great way to connect with your customer base. You can show them you can point out to the field and say, this is, how you produce your eggs. It can also save you some trips going to farmer's market or making deliveries. But if you're doing this, I would say it's best to have a farm stand or a meeting point that's a little bit further away from where your birds actually are. You'll want to reduce as much traffic into your farm as possible. So I've seen some people build farm stands at the end of their driveway out towards the road where people can come by and make their purchases there. You really don't want people walking through your birds in order to go buy their eggs. Because again, there's a chance for contamination. One of the big considerations is you may need refrigeration and some electrical hookups, but it can be done, and it can be done pretty successfully. So just something to keep in mind here. Next slide, please. So talking about people coming onto your farm, again, I've kind of mentioned with footwear, you may not know what they've walked through and then walk through your pastures. So this applies to you as well. If you're going to wear shoes out to do chores with your birds, use some that haven't really left that flock. For instance, either have a pair of boots, some rubber boots that follow the birds out in the pasture, stay with them. You can slip them on pretty quickly. And then also have a pair that you keep near the brooder. For instance, when I raise birds, I keep a pair near the brooder, and I just kind of walk out there with my normal shoes, slip those off, then put on the rubber boots and go about my chores, and then take them off before I leave the brooder, and then put on my other shoes. I never wear shoes that I might wear to the feed store or out in public in the brooder with those birds. Another thing you can use if you have guests that want to get in with the birds like this are plastic boot covers, or you call them booties. They're really they're relatively inexpensive. They're really effective in keeping down transmission of anything, and you just slip on a new pair and then throw them away or compost them as soon as you're done. They make some compostable ones, which are really nice. But they're a really quick, easy way in order to kind of prevent some of that spreading. Next slide, please. Another way to kind of help clean your footwear before you enter in anywhere with a flock is foot baths. You may have seen these here and there, but they're really cheap and easy to make. They make some specifically for the purpose of clean your shoes. There's some foaming pads, but you can make one yourself relatively inexpensively, almost under $10. You just need kind of a plastic pan or litter box, kind of a low plastic pan, and then a piece of AstroTurf or a floor mat that kind of has some bristles on it that'll fit the bottom of that pan. And basically you'll want to fill water up over that piece of AstroTurf or that mat, and then add in your disinfectant. And the disinfectants, you need to follow your instructions on how to mix that, because some of them can be quite caustic. I've had the bottom of some shoes melted off due to some of the disinfectants, so you want to keep that in mind as something to use. I would recommend against using bleach in this instance because it can often be inactivated even after one use or just by staying outside. So it's a lot of work to kind of keep that fresh. But basically, when someone wants to use the foot bath, they'll walk into it and take a brush, kind of clean the sides and the tops of their boots or shoes, and kind of wipe their feet as they would if you're entering someone's house on a rainy day. And that's about it. Next slide, please. Now, the placement of foot baths is also very important, because I've also seen people on tours or at farms avoid foot baths, step over them. Sometimes you don't want to get your shoes soaked or wet, depending on what you're using. So you really want to make sure you put it at a point where people are going to have to walk through it. Maybe put up a sign that says, please use a foot bath before you enter this area. Some people crack their For instance, if on tours they crack their gates where you have to walk through it in order to get into that pasture. Some people put it right at the entrance to their brooder area, but really just having it where you force that traffic through a footbath will really go a long way into its overall utilization. Next slide, please. So vehicles are ever present coming on your farm, whether it's a feed delivery or whether you're driving out to the farmer's market or to go make a delivery. Vehicles are everywhere. There are some farms that have very strict guidelines on vehicles coming on their farm and actually power wash them near the entrance of those farms. And so they'll have a brush and scrub the tires and kind of the undercarriage as much as possible and then power wash it off. I'm not saying you have to do that every time a new car comes on your property. In a lot of cases, that's very time consuming and can be a big barrier to you getting your chores done. But I'd say it is an option that can be used quite effectively. If you can't do that, there are a couple other things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. For instance, you should plan for these vehicles coming on your farm and making sure there's roadways that are away from any chance of birds coming in contact with those roadways. For instance, if you have a parking lot for your store, for when you have tours, you should not be rotating birds through that pasture. You should keep them separate from that if you're not washing your cars. Another thing to kind of consider, if you have feed bins, make sure that the truck isn't going to have to drive through areas or pastures or parts of your farm that your birds will be on in order to get to those feed bins in order to fill them. Again, just kind of if there's something on the tire that rolls onto your pasture, that it's a possible form of contamination. Again, not trying to be scary here, but it can happen. It happened a little bit in that 2015 outbreak, but just something to keep in mind overall. Next slide, please. So again, talking about possible fomites, equipment is a big one, and the types of materials used on your equipment can be a part of this. So for instance here, just kind of illustrate this point, I have some what you call catch coops or transport coops. On the left is a homemade one. On the right are just some plastic ones that you can buy from different farm equipment stores or outlets online. The big difference here is the one on the left is using wood, which is a porous material and can sometimes absorb manure or some of the pathogens present in it and hold it there. Which is why when using equipment, it's not a great idea to use wood if you're building something. Something like metal is fine, but plastic is especially nice in this instance because it's lightweight, it's durable, and it can be washed and sanitized very easily. So if you're making your own equipment, just kind of keep that in mind when using something that has a porous surface such as wood. Using it many times in a row can actually end up passing something on. So just something when you're keeping your building or keeping this in mind when you're building some equipment yourself. Next slide, please. So moving on a little bit, feed is one of the big attractants to wild birds or wild animals. And so spillage is really one of the big problems here. And that can be spillage from moving feeders and one kind of tips over and spills them out. But one of the more common ways feed is spilled is the chickens themselves spill it. A big way to prevent this is based on how you place the feeders or what kind of feeders you're using. A good rule of thumb to really reduce a lot of spillage is to keep the lip of the feeder equal with the back of the bird. So as the bird grows, you'll want to increase or put the feeder up on blocks or heighten it in some way. Some people have hanging feeders, so you can just put it up a few notches of the chain. That will really help cut down on a lot of the spillage, and in turn will reduce the numbers of some of the wild animals coming in contact with your feed. Next slide, please. Talking about storing feed, I would recommend against just keeping a bag of feed on the ground. Mice like to chew through that. It's very easy for that feed to kind of degrade in quality over time. So you should be checking it regularly to make sure that there's no mold issues that might lead to aflatoxin issues. And you know, keep records on the last time you bought feed or how long you've had it, and make sure that it's going to still be quality that you're going to feed to your birds, so they're not going to have any issues. Talking about storing it, again, don't leave it in a bag. Something like these drums here are very helpful in excluding wild animals or birds. Another kind of improvised method, for instance, for us, we had a chest freezer that that broke and we couldn't fix, so we put a latch on it and kind of used that as a method of feed storage. Nothing could really get in unless we opened it up, and the seal actually helped kind of keep the feed fresh for longer. So you can improvise something like that. Just make sure that it really is going to exclude any potential pests. Next slide, please. So the feed itself, it can actually go a long ways in keeping your flock healthy. Make sure that you're feeding correctly based on your species, whether it's turkeys, they require a very high protein ration, whereas laying hens don't need as much as that. Make sure that it's age specific. Chickens, based on either the cycle they're in or at what point of their lifespan they're in, will require different formulations. So make sure you're planning for that. And again, what the product is you're looking for. Feed can go a long way in overall performance and in health. Make sure it's fresh. Keep records on when you bought it. Just kind of take a handful of it and smell it, and you'll kind of notice some off smells or texture differences. Make sure you keep it in a dry, cool place. And then also be aware of nutritional deficiencies. This is kind of an area of health that can get overlooked in some cases, but make sure you're adding in a vitamin premix that's going to be cover all the nutritional bases for your birds. This is especially important if you're feeding a mix of your own grains to your birds, or doing some feed mixing at home yourself. Make sure that that vitamin premix is present. Next slide, please. So water also goes a long way in keeping a flock healthy. Obviously, you want a well-hydrated flock, especially somewhere like here in Texas. Having continuous access to cold, clean water is vitally important. Birds, they can't sweat, so to keep cool, they really need a consistent source of water. But you need to consider the source of your water. Make sure you test it to see if there are any potentially problematic things in the water there to look out for, whether it be certain metals or bacteria. And consider your design of your water. Something like this that kind of leads to standing water, I wouldn't recommend. Also, the birds can get in and kind of contaminate that water for others drinking it. It's kind of a hassle. Maybe a little bit easier to clean, but the water the birds are going to be drinking may not be as clean. Don't let water stand for periods of time. Automatic waters that continuously refresh as birds drink are really important or needed even in pastured poultry situations. And I'd say clean the waters as often as possible. It was usually my least favorite chore to do, but it is very important for the overall bird's health. And if you are using something that, let's say like nipple waters, make sure that they're not leaking. Some of the leaks, especially on nipple waters, can be really hard to detect until it's too late and the shavings underneath or the area is really kind of flooded. So really kind of pay attention to make sure that you're not having any issues there, because that water buildup and that moisture inside of a house or outside is really going to lead to some negative health outcomes. Next slide, please. So your stocking density is also going to be pretty important. Again, going back to that example of being on a bus with one sick person, if you're really enclosed into close quarters with a lot of people, it's going to spread more quickly and closer to you or that bird. So in the brooder, the rule of thumb is usually 1 square foot per bird. And that's just kind of the standard that people really talk to. But for different housing systems, it's really variable on what you're doing. And if you're moving that house, if it's outdoors, how much access to pasture do your birds have? So it really depends. And so a lot of it's going to take some observing On air quality, can you smell any ammonia? Any issues with ventilation? Are the birds having any negative outcomes such as feather picking or cannibalism? That may be an indicator that you have too many birds in one place. If they're outside, how often are they tearing up the pasture that they're on? How often do you have to move them? All of these things kind of will go a long ways into telling you how you need to manage your flock. Next slide, please. Again, the environment, especially when you raise birds on pasture in a system such as this one here, your environment will go a long way into how you manage your birds. And so with something with kind of green, lush pastures like this, it'll be a really good indicator when you need to move those birds. However, some disease-causing agents can stay present in the soil for years, or can be active for a long time. So you need to be aware of that. And when you're managing your overall farm, how you're moving animals through those pastures and which ones will follow, or what species will follow another. Keep that in mind. But being outside in a system such as this, you do have 3 natural defenses, and that is UV radiation from the sun, temperature. Again, I mentioned avian influenza in 2015 was allowed to thrive a little bit more because of the overall conditions outside. It was wet and cold, so it was able to thrive a little bit more before it started to get hotter in the summer. And then time. So sometimes just resting pastures really goes a long way in letting those natural systems take over and exclude some of those viruses or pathogens. Next slide, please. So when talking about moving your birds around on pasture, the big one is obviously if you're seeing bare soil, you need to start moving those birds and allow that soil or those forages to regenerate as much as possible. Poultry manure is what we call very hot. It's very high in nitrogen. It's a very good fertilizer, but when applied directly onto a plant, it can be a little caustic. So you'll really want to give them a chance to rest and a chance for those plants to rest and regenerate when you move those birds. Also avoid any areas where water is going to pool up after rain or some kind of flooding. Standing water can oftentimes attract birds, but it can also be a big source of contamination. So you want to make sure you don't bring birds anywhere close to that. And again, know the history of your farm. Know if there's been any poultry, any problems with the disease on your farm. Even something like Merrick's disease can be present for a few years. So just kind of be aware when you're moving on to a new farm. Next slide, please. So again, talking about standing water, here's a good example of something to avoid. This is a watering system, but they're obviously having some problems with the levels of it, and it's spilling out and over. And so when birds walk through that, there is a chance for that they might pick up something. So again, watch your watering systems. If you have a house with gutters on it, sometimes those gutters can overflow and spill water very close to entrances for where poultry come into houses. So be aware that those are clean as well and where that water is running off to. You really want to avoid a situation like this and maybe move to a different style of automatic water, like a bell or a nipple type water. Next slide, please. So for multi-flock farms, there are a lot of pasture poultry producers that don't just produce eggs, they also produce turkeys or broilers or other, or have several flocks of laying hens. But again, the same rules apply. Do not mix flocks at different ages. Younger birds are more susceptible to disease and older ones can pass it on to them. And again, keep rotations away from each other. If you have multiple flocks in multiple, what we would call egg mobiles or mobile laying houses like this, make sure that they're far enough and away and that they won't switch birds, that birds won't go spend the night in the other house. And really, this is just kind of, you can go a couple lengths of a football field or 100 yards. That'll usually be far enough where the birds won't go and kind of visit. Again, also making sure those houses are good places to stay, that they're well ventilated, that they're secure, that they have enough feed and water goes a long way in making sure those birds won't really explore farther than they need to, that they won't hop the fence and go look for something else. So make sure your conditions are going to want to keep them around. Next slide, please. And again, I want to stress that if you're doing your chores, start from the brooder and then move to your older flocks. Again, I've mentioned it quite a few times at this point, but that's really needs to be the rule of thumb. And then use the same equipment with a specific flock if you can. Try not to switch feeders. If, say, you need an extra feeder in the brooder, don't go out to your pasture and grab one. And if you have to, sanitize it completely. And again, wear different boots or use plastic booties if at all possible. Even Footbaths will help on day-to-day chores, not just for tours. Next slide, please. So again, some farms raise turkeys and chickens together. Some are on the same farm. Some raise ducks or geese on the same farm as they have chickens. But I would say avoid mixing flocks of different species, especially when it comes to turkeys and chickens. There are some diseases that chickens may be the carrier of that affect turkeys more than they affect chickens, that lead to higher mortality rates, for instance. So I would say be aware of that and be aware if there's any problems with either of your flocks in that case. And so don't follow your chicken or your chickens with turkeys, for instance. The only time I really haven't seen a problem is some people are starting to use geese as livestock guardians, and I haven't really seen any problems with diseases affecting one species or the other. Next slide, please. The big example that I'm kind of getting at for turkeys is Blackhead, which is a protozoan disease. Chickens can be a carrier for it, but really aren't affected as much by it as turkeys are. It causes very high mortality in turkeys and can really be a problem. So we have Charles Spencer, one of our former poultry specialists, wrote a very good publication on this that we have available on the ATTRA website. But it's just something to keep in mind when managing multi-species farms, that there can be outcomes where one disease can affect another species, and this is really a big example of it. Next slide, please. So talking about disposal of carcasses or manure, there's a few options here, and obviously some considerations that must be taken when you have these on farm. And so one of the big ones is burial. People will just bury carcasses of mortalities or dead birds. You want a 4-foot depth at a minimum. This is to kind of prevent a lot of coyotes or other predators from coming and digging those up. And don't leave just kind of open pits. Make sure you're covering it with at least 2 feet of soil at a time. Big problems here again are potential predators coming and digging that up. So be aware of that. And then also runoff. Be aware that you're not near any sensitive water sources, that you're not going to be using that water in your flocks. And then also it might warrant putting up a berm around it to kind of prevent any runoff to anywhere else in the farm. Next slide, please. Composting is also very popular. Again, you'll want to keep this away from any of your main buildings, your houses, your flock, your feed bins for unwanted odors, or it can also be an attractant to pests, so just kind of be aware of that. If managed correctly, it shouldn't be that much of a problem, but make sure that you're also keeping your flocks far away from any compost piles, as chickens like to sometimes go and dig through those. So just be aware of that and make sure that you're excluding those flocks. Next slide, please. Incineration is another one that I've been asked about a couple of times. It's really more useful for smaller carcasses or birds like laying hens rather than broilers or even turkeys, but it is very hard to implement. There are a lot of state-specific rules to incineration, so it varies depending on what state you're in. And this is usually due to air quality regulations and can be harder to track on your farm. It can also be very expensive. Incinerators themselves are very expensive, and then a fuel cost to keep it running is something to be aware of. For all of these things, check with your environmental regulatory agency in your state, because there may be different regulations that you are subject to when disposing of poultry carcasses. Next slide, please. So manure management is obviously a big part of this. I recommend composting manure from the brooder. or from poultry houses and then using it later on. But again, manure is one of the is a very large mode of transmission of poultry diseases. So if you find that your flock has something, whether it be in the brooder or later on life, you need to remove that manure. It needs to be composted separate from any other composting piles. And again, if you're using tools such as shovels to get it out of your brooder or wherever you have it, make sure you're disinfecting those after use and you don't re-implement those on your farm. Pretty simple stuff, but just something that can be overlooked really easily. Next slide, please. So I just want to take a few moments to talk about sanitation. Sanitation is not just spraying something off with water. It's a combination of cleaning, which may be removing that organic material such as dirt, feathers, or even manure, and then also disinfecting, which will just kill off any microorganisms that may still be on that surface. So you can use water or a brush to get off any kind of organic material, and then use a sanitizing agent to kill anything that might be left over. And so with this, you need to oftentimes leave a sanitizing agent on that surface for a little bit longer. Different ones have different instructions or different uses, so become familiar with some of those labels. If you are looking to be certified organic, here's kind of a small list of some that can be used. Acetic acid or vinegar is very commonly used. Bleach, as long as it's diluted, is pretty common. Hydrogen peroxide is very good for cleaning out waters. And peracetic acid also gets used sometimes. So, you know, look for the instructions on how to clean with these things and make sure that you're killing off any of those microorganisms or pathogens. Next slide, please. So again, I talked a little bit at the beginning about monitoring and record keeping and making sure that you're not having any problems or are able to detect any potential problems before they happen. I'm really big advocate of spending time with your flocks other than just replacing feed in the feeders or adding more water. You know, put down the feed bucket and watch your flock about 15 minutes each day and look for anything abnormal. If you've been raising birds for more than a couple of months, you'll kind of understand what their daily routine looks like. And if something's different, it should be pretty easy to see. So I'm a real big advocate for spending time with your flock. Next slide, please. And so, like I said, things will be off, but here are some common signs that there are some problems. Depressed activity where they're not moving around a lot, or ruffled feathers are kind of a big one. This picture here is a turkey with fowl pox. And it has some kind of ruffled feathers and it's kind of avoiding the rest of the flock. And so that's kind of a big sign, is you'll see a bird not just sitting, but sitting and kind of huddling, and it looks like it doesn't want to do anything else than just sit there. There will be some breathing problems, kind of be quiet, and you can kind of hear some sneezing or some wheezing, and that can be a tip-off for some respiratory issues. Again, kind of be aware of what their manure looks like. If they have diarrhea, that can be a key indicator of some internal problems, or if there's some blood in their stool. Not always. There's some times where it may be just a normal function of their body, but and a lot of times if it's over a longer period of time, it can be a problem. Look at their face, see if there's any nasal discharge, or if they have any buildup around the eyes, or if there are any pox, anything like that, and look for any swelling around the joints. That can also be some problems. And then this last point, drop in production, that's where you really want to keep records on how many eggs you're getting, how many mortalities you're having, if how much feed uptake, or how much feed they're going through. Those can be kind of early signs that might give you clues that there's a problem. Next slide, please. So quarantine, if you're starting to see any of these problems, I'd say removing that bird from a flock is pretty essential to not only monitor them further, but make sure the rest of your flock does not then become infected. So you need to remove them to an area that is safe and secure, has easy access to fresh feed and water, is well ventilated, much kind of like a brooder again, like returning them to the brooder, not to your actual brooder, but to something that has similar conditions. And they need to be there for at least 30 days. And then after that 30 days, if they're still exhibiting symptoms, you need to start over and keep them there for another 30 days. If you're doing chores, go to these places last and after you're going to anywhere else on the farm, and make sure that you're using boots that stay in that quarantine area. And so you don't want to transmit anything back to the flock if you have to run back out there. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about diagnosing problem, obviously a lot of these are just clues that you can use, but may not be an over or a be-all end-all to diagnosing a problem. Poultry veterinarians are somewhat hard to find. It's a very specialized area of veterinary medicine. And so there are different ways you can get a concrete answer. And one of those is using diagnostic laboratories. Every state's land-grant university should have a diagnostic laboratory for poultry. And there's several types of samples you can send in, whether it's a dead bird or for a necropsy. You can do some tissue samples, different organs or samples to send in that way. You can also do swabs, which will allow for live birds, as well as some blood samples. So there's different things you can send in. Next slide, please. And usually to start this process, you'll fill out a form such as this and check what you're sending in, obviously, and a little bit of context as to why or what problems you're having. You'll fill out your general contact information, and then also the age of the bird, what species they are, any kind of information that might be helpful to provide that overall context as, or to kind of give them an idea of where this bird's at, its history, and then they can give you an answer on what it might have. A big point to note here is if you take a bird to the diagnostic lab by car, you will not get that bird back. Once it enters that facility, it's going through the necropsy evaluation process. So they're going to take a look at everything. So you just be aware of that you're not going to be coming home with that bird. You're going to be coming home with information about it. So just kind of a point of to remember there. Next slide, please. Some of the things you can do that require a live bird are you can do swab samples. A lot of these swabs can be purchased from the labs themselves or from veterinary medicine equipment stores online. And so that you can either do from the mouth, there's the trachea for any respiratory illnesses, or from just the mouth. And you can also do back at the vent to kind of get an idea of what if there are any internal issues that way. Next slide, please. Another big mode of sampling is blood collection. And this is something that can be done. I'd say it's a two-person job if you've never done it before, someone to hold the bird and someone to draw the blood. Probably the easiest area to take blood from is the wing or the brachial vein. So it's the vein when you're holding the wing out, it'll be, and I apologize for not having a picture here, but it'll be running over what looks like the elbow of the bird, essentially. And so the vein's pretty apparent there. You might need to remove a few feathers, but just taking a few, or just taking a little bit from there can go a long way. And so you'll want to collect those in small test tubes and take them to the vet, and they'll spin them down, and that'll be really helpful for looking for any kind of diseases that way. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest ways to evaluate birds or look for any potential problems is a necropsy. Again, this is a recently deceased bird that you can send in. If you find one, chill it as soon as possible, but do not freeze it. What we do is we seal it into a plastic bag and then put it in the refrigerator, which can sometimes be off-putting if someone comes and opens the fridge and there's a dead chicken there, but it needs to be chilled down to where it's not going to spoil or there's going to be any problems that come in afterwards. So you can send it in through the mail with a styrofoam cooler with ice packs or dry ice, but don't wait any longer than 48 hours. After that, the waters become a little bit more muddy on those results. So sending it overnight or getting it in as soon as possible is recommended. Next slide, please. So kind of in conclusion with all this, biosecurity planning is really taking all of this information and applying it to your own farm. And I know it's a lot of information, it's a lot of different areas to kind of think of, but it's just kind of thinking of any process that's going to come in and interact with your farm in putting it down on paper. So and even outlining your daily operating procedures. Again, record keeping is very important, and I would say even writing out these procedures and having them in a hard copy for someone to look at is important, and that includes how often you clean or you refill the waters and feeders, maps of your pastures and your plans for rotations by species. You'll also want to know where your boundaries are at and what kind of fences you're dealing with, where roads are, how often you have trucks come through certain areas. And you want to separate these by low risk and high risk areas. High risk obviously being areas where there's lots of traffic coming through, roads, anything like that. And lower risk areas being pastures where there's only going to be laying hens or there's only going to be turkeys, something like that. Also list off personnel that you've authorized come onto your farm, that being you, yourself, interns, any farm workers, and having their contact information. Then also having a veterinarian contact information, whether that be the diagnostic laboratory or your local veterinarian. Keep that information listed, so if you're not there and you can't say, well, you need to call this person, that you can have someone else, or someone else can look that up and call pretty easily. Again, it's just putting all this into paper, and then if there are problems, going back to see what went wrong, where exactly are there problems. Is there a footbath that wasn't being replaced? Are you not using the right equipment? Kind of keep an inventory of what equipment you need per flock or per brooder. So just kind of putting all this together is really important in making sure you're going to have your defenses up against any possible diseases you might have on your farm. And next slide, please. And with that, that's the end of my presentation here. I'd be happy to take any questions, and we'll try to get to a few here, and then I would be more than happy to follow up afterwards through our ATTRA website or through our ATTRA hotline. Thanks.
Okay, this is Rich again, and I have some questions that participants have sent in. First, do you have any opinions on fermenting feed or sprouting grains for feed?
Yeah, so that's something we've gotten a few questions on sprouting grains for feed. I personally don't have a lot of experience, but I do know of a farmer here in Texas who is fermenting feed and scaling up his practice of doing so. And as long as you're fermenting it in a clean environment or sprouting it in a clean environment, and not leaving it to just spoil too much, it can be very beneficial for your poultry and kind of building overall gut health. It really helps that microflora in the gut. With sprouts, a lot of people are really looking to maybe lean on that too much as their overall diet for poultry, and poultry really aren't ruminants. They don't get a lot out of sprouts or grasses, so it's more of kind of a treat or something you can use in the winter to supplement their regular ration. But the fermented feed, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know some farmers that are doing really well with it. I would say people need to look into how they're doing it, but it can be very beneficial.
Great. Another question. I'm going to read this one, and I like this. Kevin has extremely high standards in his poultry farm practices, which builds trust and confidence with his customer base. I'm sure that's true. Is there any certifying body or trust agency that customers and buyers can refer to so they can buy a product from a farmer rancher that practices the same high values and standards that Kevin has?
Yeah. As far as, I wouldn't say there's a biosecurity label if we're talking about this. There are a lot. I would say probably the closest possible thing, if you're really wanting to show off your standards in an easy format, would be an animal welfare certification. There are several third-party certifiers, such as Certified Humane, Animal Welfare Approved, Global Animal Partnership are kind of the big three. One of those, I think it's Animal Welfare Approved, it provides their marketing materials for free as long as you adhere to those standards. And so it really, in that case, it's finding one of those programs where the standards closely match up to your own and are a good representation of your farm. And it really can help some people just kind of, are either looking for that, or it's kind of an extra assurance that they know what they're getting if they can't make it out to the farm. So if if you are having those high standards, that's a good way to present that as such. I've also noticed some people, I worked on a project where we were starting a poultry cooperative with other farmers in the area, and so we were all agreeing on standards and using that as a part of our marketing material. So sometimes it's even a case of incorporating those into your own marketing materials and saying, here's what the process looks like, here's what they're fed, and using that, because I would say people are more interested in that nowadays and are more willing to go look and see what some of the standards are. They may not want to dig through all of the standards on stocking density and feed composition on a website on animal welfare, but they kind of want a bird's eye view of everything, and some labels can help. There's also a debate on, do we have too many labels now? But I'd say with animal welfare, sometimes having that can really help.
Okay, well, we've kind of gone over the hour, so I think we'll end it there. If you send in a question and we haven't answered it, we'll be getting back to you via email. We'd like to thank, again, the Southern Risk Management Education Center for funding today's webinar. And as a reminder, it will be posted in the next few days on the ATTRA website. You see the address right there. www.attra.ncat.org. And while you're there, you can check out our other sustainable agriculture resources. We have other webinars and a new podcast, Voices from the Field. We have videos and lots of really good publications, databases, all sorts of things, so you want to check it out. And I would also like to remind our viewers again to please take a few minutes to complete the survey that you'll see when you sign out. It really does help us improve webinars in the future. And thanks again for attending today's webinar.